Welcome to the Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. We're taking a brief break this month from our usual weekly schedule to bring you a dedicated episode featuring a special guest, Beutter Cohen. Uli is a New York City-based documentarian, artist, and the creator of Subway Book Review, a unique series that originated on Instagram, where she documents through writing and photography people's experiences with books. In the last 8 years, Uli has ridden just about every New York subway line where she's selectively interviewed and photographed New Yorkers about the books they're reading while they're waiting for and riding on the trains. Her conversations provide fascinating insight into how book culture is really all culture writ large. Many of her Instagram interviews have been compiled into her own book called Between the Lines: Stories from the Underground, which is published by Simon & Schuster and available now. Believe me, this is the book you want if you're looking for book recommendations. In this interview, Uli describes the origins of Subway Book Review, its evolution into a book culture touchstone, and what her years-long cultural observation, as she calls it, has taught her about our society's collective ambitions, hopes, and challenges. And stick around to the very end to hear what she really thinks about librarians. All right, Uli, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me, Bill. I'm excited to be here with you.
Sure. So are we. So let's start. What inspired you to start Subway Book Review?
Well, I think like any artist or documentarian or a person who is obsessed with finding out what moves the world, when I arrived in New York City, I wanted to find an iconic location where I could observe and capture some of the inhabitants of our time. And the underground is, of course, a place where a lot of life happens, but also where movements are born, literally and physically speaking. And the subway fascinated me because it's a very democratic place. Many New Yorkers take it from all walks of life on a daily basis, especially before the pandemic. Just to put some context to the question, I started Subway Book Review in December 2013, so very, very different time. But it struck me as a place where New York City had to finally stand still and I could actually see these fellow New Yorkers. And what I found was that so many of them were reading printed books. And being a lifelong reader and bookworm myself, I thought these readers probably had very interesting insights to offer, not just in terms of the books that they were reading, but also who they were and where they were going.
Mm-hmm.
And I came prepared. I had my tools ready to go and decided to approach these people and ask them some questions. And many years later and thousands of conversations later, and by now I've ridden every subway line end to end and have traveled and talked to people in all 5 boroughs. I can say that hunch has paid off. Readers indeed have a lot of amazing stories to share.
Yeah, yes, they actually have. So you mentioned some tools. How do you approach these interviews?
Oh, Bill, my tools are very simple because, Bill Cunningham said the best camera is the one that you have on you, and I go by that. So I do everything mobile. I do everything on my phone. I photograph the photography I do on my phone. The audio recording I do on my phone. I have a little microphone attachment, but I have to keep it pretty nimble and I have to keep it pretty mobile. Not to scare people off or away or make them feel worried like their soul's going to be taken away from them.
Right.
So yeah, I keep it very mobile and I keep it very easy. And 8 years into it, I think that how many years is it? 8, 9? I've lost track. I think I'm officially 8 years into it.
Okay.
Yeah, you practice that muscle like a painter would, or any other kind of creative exercise that you're pursuing.
Right. So why do it through social media? What was sort of the attraction there for you?
Well, I started the project on social media because, I mean, that's the medium of our time, that's the canvas of
Yeah.
our time. And the whole point was to not do this in isolation. The whole point was to let the world know what New York is reading so that people could feel inspired to speak to, what we consider strangers. I think the whole concept of stranger is kind of flawed and has brought things into the world that are not good. But
Mm.
that's a different conversation that we can get into if you'd like. But to speak to strangers in their own city, to observe who their neighbors are more closely, and to not be afraid to do something that humanity has done from the beginning of time, which is to find out who we are collectively. So that was my intention with sharing it on social media. And of course, to also help people find their next read and to, yeah, just share the joy.
Yeah, yeah, excellent. So, Subway Book Review, I mean, you mentioned you started it 8 years ago, so it's expanded quite a bit. Besides the book, which we'll talk about in a minute, how have you grown SBR and I think you've spun some things off of it. You're in different cities now. I saw you opened up a pop-up shop. Like, what have you done in the meantime?
Oh, so many things, Bill. Where do we begin? I mean, I have a wonderful newsletter that people should absolutely sign up for. People can follow me on Instagram. I've written a book, which is the most prolific thing that has happened in my life during the
Mm,
pandemic, because I made that book in 2020 and it came out in November 2021. So the pandemic was a very not restful experience for myself. The book is called Between the Lines, Stories from the Underground, and that's a collection of 7 years of work. And most of the stories in the book have never been published anywhere else before. So it's a really, I'm very proud of it. And I think that having, of course, the project in a physical form is incredibly satisfying. And the readers have given me great feedback that they love just turning a page and not having to scroll.
mm,
And I host many events, especially before the pandemic. That was the case so much more. But I hope that this spring that can come back, mostly in New York City, but also virtual. I host workshops that people can find out about. And then, like you mentioned, I also do crazy things like host a party on the G train or start a pop up bookshop inside Union Square Station for 12 days, which I did last year right before the holidays. And I didn't just sell books, I also was a place where people could fulfill a wish of someone who wanted to get a particular book at Rikers Island, which is
mm,
one of New York's prisons. And it's one that's in really bad shape and should have been closed a long time ago and somehow is still open. And people are lacking services on all ends, but books are, of course, something that are in high demand because that's one of the only choices that an incarcerated person can make during their time in prison.
mm.
So I continue to find ways to expand and connect. And you mentioned that I am in other cities. That has had to come to a halt during the pandemic. I was in 20 other cities with contributors who were speaking to people on their underground systems before the pandemic, but that had to be put on pause because I could not, with good conscience, ask anyone to go
Oh,
into the
sure.
underground and talk to people on my behalf. That felt
Absolutely.
sketchy and dangerous.
Right, right. So, I just want to go back to the book a little bit more. Can you just sort of talk a little bit about how that actually came together? In terms of coming up with the book and deciding to do the book.
Yeah, I mean, the book I would say, was a very organic process in that I have a literary agent that went out with my pitch.
Hmm.
Simon and Schuster. The book went to auction. Simon and Schuster then acquired it, and I would say the most challenging thing was to capture new interviews and photographs that were brand new during a time when everyone turned inward.
Yeah.
And by that, I mean, we were literally in isolation. We remember 2020 well, the spring of 2020. But I also had a deadline, and I love to keep a deadline. And I love to work around an obstacle creatively and to find a solution. So making the book became a bit of a different undertaking, but it also expanded my creative practice, and it also expanded what the project can be. And that was, of course, something that I could have, hoped for in the ideal case. So the big difference in the book is that, of course, you get, interviews and photographs the way that you see on Subway Book Review, but I could go into more depth and in more detail with some people. I
Hmm.
also took the freedom to have phone calls with people that I really wanted to know what they were reading during that time or what their favorite book was, like Roxane Gay or Min-Jin Lee or Gia Tolentino, who are, of course, authors who we really love, but also New York artists like Waris Aluwalia, who's a phenomenal designer, or Jamel Shabazz, who's a really iconic street photographer in New York. So it was really liberating to kind of stay true to the concept of speaking to readers, but also not feel so confined to the underground. And at the same time, I also met a lot of people at their favorite subway station, or I ran into a lot of people before the pandemic, or as we were coming out of it a little bit and the city was opening up. And so you get all kinds of amazing stories. For example, from Queen Jean, who reads Homegoing by Yad Jesse and talks about the power of the Black matriarchy, or Nicholas, who read Hermann Hesse and thought about what the next 10,000 years could look like,
Hmm.
or a woman named Lita, who has changed her life with color theory, and talks about the book by Madeline Gins that really put her on that path more firmly. So you get book recommendations, but beyond that, you really, I think, get a vision for the future in between the lines, and what we are thinking about, not just as an individual, but these themes emerged. And so I chaptered the book accordingly. And so you might find yourself in a chapter called Trees, or Time, or Space, or Power, or
Uh-huh.
Movement, or Fabric. And you can read the book front to back, or you can jump into a chapter, or you can open a page randomly and see what it brings you. And
Hmm.
that feels very satisfying.
Yeah, it sounds like it. You've described the project as a quote cultural observation, and I imagine that some of the things you've just remarked on kind of support that phrase in terms of the individual stories that you're getting and the way people sort of describe how they relate to the books they're reading. Is that kind of what you mean by the term cultural observation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that when you find yourself at a moment in time, it's incredibly difficult to step outside of yourself and to understand what role in history you're playing. That's nearly impossible. But I think when you can take on the perspective of other people, and you also get to see yourself reflected in their story, you get to maybe see the opposite of yourself reflected in their story.
Hmm.
That gives you the best chance to take on a broader perspective and to reflect on who it is you are and what it is you're doing. And I think specifically now and in the next, 5 years, we're really tasked with building a new world, because we understand so many challenges now
Hmm.
very, very clearly, more clearly than ever before, collectively, which is very rare, because we all had to pause and all had to look at these challenges together, and we couldn't look away and we couldn't get away from them, right? I'm talking about the healthcare crisis. I'm talking about the racial injustice crisis that
Hmm.
exists. I'm talking about the wage gap. I'm talking about the climate crisis. We're aware of it. We're aware of it collectively, and that is very daunting. But I think that by just reaching out to each other and listening to each other and really seeing each other, those are the first steps that we have to take. And I hope to encourage people to do that.
That's excellent. And I'm just that makes me wonder. Since 2013, when you started this, I wonder if you've noticed any kind of evolution in the books that you see people reading and talk to people about reading, especially in the last half dozen years or so. Have they changed, and are people tending to read titles that are about or adjacent to many of the subjects you've just described?
Yeah, absolutely. I started the project in the Obama years, which feels so far
It
away.
does, yeah.
And then we had to make it through the Trump administration, which in my mind was a horrendous experience. And
Mm-hmm.
we're lucky to still be here. So um, I will say that very clearly. And I think if anyone follows Subway Book Review, there's no doubt that I have a very specific point of view
Yes,
on the world. So, not shy to speak about that.
of course.
In 2016, for example, what I saw in a magnificent amount on the subway was female identifying readers consuming memoirs written by women and
Mm-hmm.
female identifying authors at a record speed. Women needed to hear from women, I think, because we were so triggered and so traumatized by the immediacy with which we were confronted with, all kinds of things. We
Yep.
remember them. We remember all the horrific things that he who shall not be named brought into our lives. Um,
Right.
so yes, 2016, the female memoir was on the rise, read on every train, which was also wonderful to see. I think that revered Black authors are always read in New York City. I see James Baldwin, I see Toni Morrison, I see a lot of Toni Morrison throughout all of the years.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Last year, it was especially Sula that I saw a lot. And then you also see people reading about particular topics last year and the year before, 2020, 2021. And I think now as well, books about healing, like Braiding Sweetgrass. You can't count them fast enough in
Mm-hmm.
terms of the amount of people who are holding them in their hands. And I think that's really beautiful, because that's an immediate reflection of people's questions that they have. Min Jin Lee said this very, very beautifully. She said, there isn't a question that a book can't answer. And I think that that's true. And that's why speaking to readers is so important, because that's how we get to find out what questions people have and what answers they're actually looking for.
Right. That's a very good point. I did want to circle back to something you talked about a little earlier, and just kind of observe that you've interviewed some pretty notable public figures, Roxane Gay being one, and I just wanted to gauge your sort of reaction to interviewing those folks and interviewing other people on the train or wherever else, and I wonder if, like, you feel like, you know reading a book is sort of we all do it. Everybody does it. And when you're talking to a more famous person, it sort of levels the playing field in terms of, this is something that we all have in common that we do, is reading books that we love. And so I'm wondering if that's kind of an impression that you got, and something that might be reflected in these interviews, that there's really, the observations are kind of, people have unique observations no matter who they are.
Yes, of course. I
Yeah.
mean, we can leave it at that, because yes, of course. You know what I mean? Like, there's no real difference between a person like Emma Straub and Faria Khan, who is a person on the street. Like,
Right.
there's the only but I mean, Faria is a bit of a cheat, because Faria is a comedian on the rise by now. So, yeah, she has her own claim to fame by far.
Right.
But say it's someone completely random who I meet on the street versus someone whose name we already know.
Hmm.
There's no difference other than that one person has expressed themselves and has been, by the public and by the media, been encouraged to continue to do that, versus someone else who maybe is also expressing themselves but is just not favored by the media, or who has never been handed the microphone. There's no difference in what they might have to offer. And a celebrity conversation could be a disappointing or boring experience. Just because they're a celebrity doesn't mean they have something to offer automatically. I just want to
Right.
say that. And I want to say that not in regards to the wonderful people who I have gotten a chance to speak with, who have been wonderful, but I think that celebrity culture in America is at an all-time high, and it's a little bit perverse how we're treating it. And I've really had to reckon with that myself and had to ask myself, the project really started with only people on the street and now has expanded to include, also names that we celebrate and celebrities. And I wanted to do that, like you say, to level the playing field and to show that it really comes down to the thoughts of a person, the hopes and dreams of a person, the fears of a person, and that they're as unique as our fingerprint, but everybody has them,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that success is such a mind game.
Yeah,
We can't assign it too much value.
exactly. Yeah. Good. So given who our audience is, I do want to address like book banning has been back in the news, unfortunately. And this time it seems like it's so much broader in scope and scale than it has been in the past, perhaps. And I'm wondering, how does your experience with Subway Book Review give you hope that these efforts to erase our history or culture and artistic expression will, ultimately fail as they always have?
Yeah, I mean, banning books is a ridiculous undertaking.
Hmm.
For every book you ban, 10 new will be written
Right.
that will not be banned. So to me, I don't, book banning is absolutely ridiculous, absurd practice. And obviously, I believe in freedom of speech and in the free expression of the mind, which of course then goes both ways, because if you believe in that, then you also believe in someone who's destructive to humanity being allowed to express themselves, right? So
Right. Right.
I think that question has become a slippery slope, and I don't know that we have enough time to address that today. But do I want a book banned that a Nazi has written that asks people to discriminate? I would like that book to be banned. You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? So then we also have to ask, well, do we want it both ways, or do we, how do we go about it? So that's what I mean. It's a very complicated question that goes much deeper than saying no book should be banned, period.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of the voices that we need to hear from, which are Black, Brown, Indigenous voices and the voices of women, because those are the voices that have been suppressed, I am very happy to see the increase in authors who are published, who fall into one of those identities and
Right.
who are also intersectional in those identities.
Mm-hmm.
I think we still have a long way to go, but I do see progress. And I just want everyone to remember, though, that just because something isn't an active headline in the media anymore doesn't mean that the problem has gone away, doesn't mean that we've solved the problem for good. We have to continue to work really diligently on creating equality in storytelling and on making sure that the microphone is passed around, not just for show, but that systematic and structural changes are made on the institutional level.
That's an excellent point. Thank you, Uli. Well, Uli, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for joining us on the Authority File.
I'm so happy to be here. And I just want to say, Bill, that I grew up in the library and I went to the library every week and I got to take a stack of books home. And I'm so grateful that libraries exist. And I think they're such an important place for gathering curious minds. And to all the librarians listening out there, you are wonderful. You're a godsend. You have no idea, even maybe you do, but you are really opening up worlds to people who otherwise would have no access to it. And I heard this all the time when I had the pop-up bookshop open in Union Square Station. To many people, having a book and buying a book is a luxury, and being able to get a book from a library is such a blessing for them. So shout out to the librarians. You rock. You're amazing.
All right. Well, thank you very much for saying that, Uli. You just heard from Uli Beutter Cohen. Uli is a New York City-based documentarian, artist, and the creator of Subway Book Review, a unique series that originated on Instagram where she documents, through writing and photography, people's experiences with books. Many of her interviews have been compiled into a book called Between the Lines, Stories from the Underground, published by Simon & Schuster and available now. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.